Right now, the day's biggest news stories from a Vegas perspective. This is the Vegas Take with Sharp and Shapiro.
All right, welcome back. It is the Vegas Take, Sharp and Shapiro. Glad you could join us on a Monday, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, some breaking news that we've learned. The piece of garbage in Virginia who tried to mow down those protesters, we're learning now that he was the head of the KKK in Virginia. Also, Joe Biden has said in the last hour in his campaign that he does not support defunding police. So that is good news. Joining us right now on the line, he'd know a little bit about these subjects. He is a retired NYPD lieutenant. You've seen him on Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC as a contributor. A tremendous amount of experience as a police officer. Very lucky to have with us. That would be Darrin Porcher. Officer Porcher, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate that.
Thanks a lot, Darrin.
Always enjoy you on television as a contributor. So much knowledge. I want to start with this. Let's start with this rhetoric we keep hearing about disbanding the police. You heard Joe Biden. Joe Biden last hour said he doesn't support it. As someone who is a retired NYPD lieutenant, does that bother you when you hear people saying things like that about about disbanding police?
Well, I got a great idea. We can send people like Alexander Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders in there to deal with the crime when we have it, because nobody can do a better job than them. No, it's just, is it bothersome? I think a lot of it is more frustrated and hyperbolic, and I think it's more of a byproduct of what happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd. I mean, you have a lot of people that are upset, and I understand, because when you look at a case of over-policing in a particular community, it really puts forth an agenda that we need to make some changes. But in making change in society from a policing perspective, it needs to be sound. You need a qualitative piece. You need empirical data to back what your expectations are. And this is clearly not the case. You just have a series of protesters that have introduced a narrative of we need to get rid of the police and we can do this on our own. But no one has thought out what the end game is in terms of the process. From the way they're projecting this, it'll end up as something as a scene depicted from the movie The Purge, so to speak. So
Right.
We just need to have smart minds at the table to move forth an agenda with benchmarks in policing in connection with reforms, and not just a complete eradication on the system, because they're looking for a moratorium. They're not looking for just the mere reduction in finances or economic empowerment.
Darrin, can you make a distinction between disbanding and defunding? Because I think there's a big difference there. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what does that mean for law enforcement and for us?
When we think of disbanding, this is a moratorium. We're going to end and collapse the police structure. When we think of we think of a lot of these scenarios, such as maybe limiting the funds. It's something different. It's just going to refer to an adjustment. But when you look to defund, you're in essence going to destroy the structure. The structure is going to collapse, because without funding, you won't have the ability to introduce police services. And from a logistical perspective and the perspective of a personnel-based system, you need cops to respond, but the cops need to respond based on communications they receive from like a 911 system. And when the cops get there, they need the necessary tools to, in terms, embark upon what they're supposed to, such as police radios, things to that effect. And it's just, the whole campaign seems to be preposterous. I understand in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, every municipal organization is going to experience a financial haircut. I got that and I accept it. But I just think that when you look to rescind part of the budget in a police department, you're probably going to you probably maybe want to focus more so on the infrastructure or newly minted programs that you're looking to erect. But just from a personnel perspective, crime fighting perspective, or even community relations component, which is huge, that police community relationship, it's just not something that sounds as a tangible fix to what we just experienced in the wake of what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Well, I watched the Minnesota City Council president. She went on CNN this morning, and she mentioned how Camden, New Jersey, had dismantled their police department, and it was very effective. Now, I was thinking to myself, that's a totally different economy. They don't have roughly the same demographics. Minneapolis is much larger. You have much more money, higher earning power. Can you describe what's happened with Camden, New Jersey, and why someone would think that would work in Minneapolis?
Well, for one, they didn't disband the police department in Camden, New Jersey. This was a combination of two factions. Under the Obama administration, they had something we refer to as a consent decree. With the consent decrees, what they do is they have members of the federal government that come in and they look at the police department, and I shouldn't even say that members of the federal government. I mean, they're hired as consultants by the federal government, and they come in and they take a look at what's going on, and they spotlight the deficiencies, and they introduce a series of recommendations. And a lot of those recommendations were implemented, such as better use of force training, a stronger police and community relationship, a greater level of transparency. That's what happened. But the structure of the police department was in no way, shape, or form taken down. And so when you look at what's happening in Minneapolis, they're looking for a moratorium on policing and provide a plausible alternative to public safety, which is really a challenge because I just can't see it. I just think that no matter how you repackage or repurpose the municipal function of policing or public service, so to speak, it's really going to be reflective of individuals that have police powers, the ability to arrest, the ability to introduce services to a community. And that's really what's going to happen. So when we think of these buzzwords that are being used, it's more hyperbolic than anything else. I agree. A reorganization of the police department more so than the eradication of the department.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Darrin Porcher. He is a retired NYPD lieutenant, tremendous amount of experience. Also a contributor on Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Darrin, let's switch topics here quickly. Let's go to Buffalo. I'm sure you've seen the video. These two officers pushing down a 75-year-old man to the ground. He's still in the hospital, my understanding, in serious condition. After these two officers were fired and now they have been criminally charged, you have close to 60 officers who have not retired from the police force, but they have said that they are stepping down from, working in these protests.
They left the unit that they were in.
Right. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Me personally, I have a problem with what these officers are doing because I think these two cops did something wrong. I think they broke the law. What do you say?
Well, I think the two sides of it. If you look at that video really closely, the person wasn't knocked down as violently as it appears.
No, he was pushed.
There were the officers that were coming towards him in more of a defensive position, but they were still advancing because if you notice on the other side of that individual, there was a contingent of protesters that they were looking to address. So it seemed as if this individual was backpedaling, so to speak. He was taking some steps back. And was there a push? Was there contact? Yes, there was. But I don't think that it was an egregious act to knock him down. And what happens after that is what I guess that's really what got things going. Because when the individual hits the floor, you see he's bleeding from the back of his head. The other officers begin to engage. There's a protester or two that are right after that person, and they start to engage that situation. I believe there's a sergeant that gets on a police radio, and he communicates a message to the police dispatcher, so to speak. And the other officers, it seems as if there's no rush to provide a level of assistance to the guy that's on the ground. I think that's troublesome, to say the least, because police are public servants, and they're there to help. In addition to that, you mentioned the officers. There were 57 officers that were assigned to, I think it was like a disorder control unit. I can't recall what the specific title for the unit was. all of those officers resigned their responsibilities to that disorder control unit in a show of solidarity. And they're now since been placed in a patrol assignment. So, as a result of that, now we have a situation whereas, cops are just looking to implement policy, and if the policy is not what we'd like it to be, then we're just going to kind of revert and do our own thing. So I'm not a fan of that neither, because I believe that, as civil servants and public servants, you need to adhere to what the agenda attributed to or connected to the rules and regulations in connection with the structure of that department. So I'm not a fan in how it was handled. I also think that it could have been handled differently in terms of the individual falling to the ground, but I don't think it was the egregious act that it appeared to be to us as viewers on television. And I just think that the cops could have done a better job to show that we are here to actually work with you, as opposed to, okay, oh, well, you fell, too bad, so sad.
Well, when you're in an officer's way and he asks you to move and you refuse to move, what's the standard protocol for an officer at that point?
If you're in an officer's way, well, it's really dependent or contingent upon what the person's doing. And when I say that, meaning like, all right, this is a protester, right? You got a right to a lawful protest. You can either ask the person to move out of the way if he was like in the direct line of the interdiction policy that you were moving forth, such as we saw protesters on the other side of that. But
Right.
That doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that we should knock the person down. There's a level of courtesy, professionalism and respect established to that, and that clearly didn't happen. This is a human being. This is somebody's relative, and he just wasn't treated with dignity, to say the least. I think that that was a situation that they should have taken more care in managing him, and it didn't happen.
You looked at the riots and the looting that took place in New York City on the worst 2 days, and it looked to me like police officers, and I know NYPD has roughly 35,000 police officers, and I know some of those are retiring and resigning, left and right. But, there's 8.4 million people in the city. It looked to me like the New York Police Department really needed that National Guard assistance. And Andrew Cuomo said there were 13,000 waiting to assist them. Why do you think that Andrew Cuomo did not call in the National Guard on those 2 nights?
Well, in Cuomo's defense, from a New York perspective, I believe he felt that, look, you know what? I want to lend deference to the local leaders. Granted, I'm the governor of the state in its entirety, but I need to lend deference to the local leaders and afford them a level of buy-in, so to speak. I think Cuomo had a different expectation of Mayor de Blasio, and Mayor de Blasio let him down, to say the least, in terms of, constructing a curfew that was
Right.
at 11 o'clock as opposed to 8 o'clock.
Exactly.
And just the NYPD's ability to police the city of 8.5 million people. I truly believe that this was one of those things, whereas he relied on de Blasio's leadership and he failed them. And as a result, the NYPD appeared as if they had a black eye in disorder control. And this was really something that came from the mayor's office. He was the individual that kind of put the brakes on the officers and subsequently allowed looting and lawless behavior to override the lawful protests that were being participated in by the masses.
Yep. Darrin, you're the perfect person to ask this question with your experience. Let's talk about racism. Let's talk about the way, or maybe you disagree with the way that maybe police officers treat minorities differently than people who look like me. I want to talk to you about that. You're a retired NYPD lieutenant. You did this for decades. You know what you're talking about. Do you believe, with your personal experience, listen, in no way, shape, or form, I think the majority of police officers are heroes like you and good people. But do you believe as a whole, this BLM, these protests, and the Black Lives Matter movement has a point when minorities say, as a whole, they do not believe that as minorities they are treated the same as somebody who looks like me who is white? Do you agree with that sentiment, and what would you say to that?
you do have instances where that occurs, but you need to focus on that specifically. But in terms of Black Lives Matter, I can understand what you're, and I'm speaking to you as an African American individual, as policed the city of New York for 20 years.
Right.
Do Black Lives Matter? Sure they do. Do all lives matter? Sure they do. Do blue lives matter? Sure they do. White lives matter. But the truth of the matter is you, and I stress you, are the actor, producer, and director in your life. Therefore, make your life matter. Things happen, and it's really unfortunate. Now look at, the riotous behavior that's happening, and it's really striking a chord with a lot of people because, people, they're tearing down their own neighborhoods. But it goes back to the African-American community believing that they've been the recipient of a miscarriage of justice. There's been a lot of incidents that have happened for years on end when we've had unarmed African-Americans that have lost their lives through police interactions. And there could be a significant component of truth as it relates to it possibly being a racial element that involved that. But at the same token, you need to act accordingly. And when I say you, meaning you have to, although if you are the recipient of a miscarriage of justice, this needs to be aired out in the criminal justice system or in internal review, such as an internal affairs bureau within the police department. I just think that this has really been a thing that's been a thorn in our sides as a society for years on end. And unfortunately, this thing has really it's exacerbated as it relates to what happened to George Floyd.
And I think we all need to bring up what you're mentioning. I agree with this. You have to comply whether you think you're being mistreated by police or not. But let's go to the harshest of situations, which is George Floyd. Let's talk about that now, Darrin, if we may. Now, I am 100% on board. This officer who had his knee on this guy's neck when George Floyd is pleading for his life, it's murder. I hope he goes to jail for the rest of his life. However, I have to sympathize a little bit, and you can tell me if you disagree with me or not. The police officer that is at the end there, his fourth day on the job, you hear the audio where he is saying, shouldn't we do this? Shouldn't we turn his body over? Shouldn't we do this? And you have the veteran cop say no. What is that officer supposed to do in that situation? Why is he in jail now? I actually don't think now that at least that officer on his fourth day should be in jail for anything, because what is that guy supposed to do in that spot as a cop on his fourth day?
There's two. One had 3 days and one had 4 days.
Right.
I truly understand. I think that this is a situation or an instance where the criminal justice system needs to lend deference to this person's lack of tenure within that department and make a decision based on the reality of what happened. Under normal circumstances, you're supposed to intercede and say that this is wrong. I'm totally against what happened and take appropriate action, such as notify a supervisor. And that didn't happen, but you also have to take in consideration the freshman content of that officer's knowledge base. And that is what you have to look to.
Yeah, I think that is. I couldn't agree with you more, and I actually think they should be lenient, more lenient at least on those officers. Let me ask you this: this officer Chauvin, if you had a chance to speak to this officer Chauvin right now, and you had 5 or 10 minutes alone with him, what would you say to him?
What would I say? I would tell him if I could speak to the officer. You said.
Yes, if you could speak to the officer Chauvin who had his knee on George Floyd's neck, who ultimately killed him. As a veteran cop, what would you say to him?
Selfish act. It was a selfish act. It was horrific. You put citizens and you put an officer in harm's way, and therefore you need to be prosecuted accordingly as it relates to what you did.
Last question. Bill de Blasio just stated yesterday that he is planning on defunding the police. Do you think that that's going to happen? How big of a chunk do you think will be dropped from the budget, and do you agree with it?
He's looking to reevaluate the resources. I don't think it's going to come into play because I don't think the city council is going to allow it. Although they're uncomfortable with it, they're going to disallow it, and it's just going to be a moot point, and it's going to be more hyperbole than an actionable case.
One more quick question, then we'll let you go, Darrin, if that's okay. I wanted to ask you this.
Sure.
For those out there in the Black Lives Matter movement who I disagree with that are saying that, all cops are bad cops and all cops are racist, which obviously I disagree with, and I think the majority do. But, however, there are some African Americans and minorities out there and some whites as well that are saying that are throwing water bottles, frozen water bottles at police, throwing rocks, just completely mistreating police, and I think it's disgusting. What would be your message to them?
Those people need to recede and accept that the social contract introduces police as our first line of defense by government. Not all cops are bad. We have a few bad apples, and we need to deal with it from an individual perspective. I'm okay with Black Lives Mattering. I'm okay with White Lives Mattering. I'm okay with Blue Lives Mattering. But it goes back to you're the actor, producer, and director in your life, so you need to make your life matter and treat people accordingly. Because if you treat people accordingly, this becomes a more harmonious reality that we're living in. Therefore, take a step back, and if your issue is of that magnitude, air out your grievances in a proper form, such as the voting block or with elected officials.
Couldn't agree with you more. Darrin, you truly are a hero. Thank you so much for your decades of work as a police officer in New York. Appreciate you. You do a great job on television as well, and we do appreciate your time, Darrin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate
thanks a lot,
Darrin. Great guy. Really smart, and really gave us some in-depth answers. I don't think I disagree with anything he said. He's really eloquent in his answers. And those are the type of cops that we need to be talking about.
Well, I think a lot of people in the country, and I'm not calling out all African Americans here, but I think a lot of people don't treat cops with respect, and they don't treat cops very well. And I think that if you listen to that interview, you could definitely get that vibe from what Darrin was saying. I think that he has been treated very poorly by a lot of people. No
question.
And I mentioned NWA earlier. NWA has done nothing at all to help the relationship between the police department across the country and young African American men and women.
Listen, I think this is very important, and I talked about this a little bit last week. I do this all the time when I see police officers. I saw 4 cops at a restaurant last week, and I don't know who they are. I don't know, but I went up to them. And I shook their hands and I said, I just want to thank you guys for what you do. And I could see in their eyes how much they appreciated it. They're so used to scumbags going up to them and saying horrible things. They said, they looked at me and said, we just want you to know how much we appreciate you doing that. I think it's important when you see a police officer out there, go up to them, thank them for what they do. Same thing with a firefighter or, anyone else, a paramedic. Just thank them for what they do. I think it's so important.